Episode 98, August to September 1915. Night fire and scorching sun in Gallipoli. It was a war between soldiers only. By John Cropton. Read by John Winskill. The author of this episode remarks, Gallipoli was not a pleasant place in 1915. Yet, in spite of the miseries they endured, the continuous sniping, the grilling heat, the plague of insects, and the scourge of dysentery, the men who served in this arduous campaign were, as Mr. Cropton says, determined to remain cheerful to the end. In contrast to other episodes, we have dealt with the fierce carnage of hand-to-hand fighting. This one is a record of quiet endurance between battles. Summer dragged on into autumn in Gallipoli with trench routine and interminable working parties. I remember our first digging party when we were in the support line. We filed out of a communication trench along a partially dug trench, 18 inches or 2 feet deep. It was our business to deepen it. It was a still, starlit night. The well-known aromatic scent of the scrub mingled with the equally well-known smell of dead Turks and chloride of lime. Looking back, you could see the long green ray punctuated with little red crosses that marked a hospital ship lying off W Beach. A dog bayed in the Turkish trenches. Cicalas sang. From the front line came the continuous crack of rifles. Rifle fire was kept up all night in Gallipoli. Around us was the continual whistle of bullets, punctuated occasionally by the cruel whir of a ricochet. The Turks tended to fire high at night, and their bullets would kill people in the gullies behind the line. On this occasion, we could hear them futting into the ground around us and into the little knee-high parapet. An engineer sergeant crawled along, giving orders in whispers. We started to dig, keeping as far as possible behind the low parapet. We worked in pairs, one man loosening the earth with a pick and the other shoveling it out. Dig, dig, dig. Phew-fut, phew-fut. Groans from the end of the line passed the word down for a stretcher-bearer. We saw them running over the top. Silhouetted against the sky, the groans ended with a long sigh. There was silence. A whisper. "Who is it?" "Don't know. They say it's Pharaoh." Presently, we climbed out of the trench and crouched down in the scrub to allow the stretcher-bearers to pass with the stretcher. We went on digging. It was Pharaoh. Probably dead. He was our platoon officer. He'd been married whilst the division was at Blandford. Our casualties from enemy fire during that August and September were not heavy, but there was a constant drain from sickness. Those of the older hands who had survived so far had gained some measure of immunity. They were all suffering from dysentery, but were mostly able to carry on. Looking back on that time, I'm overwhelmed by a feeling of intense admiration and respect for my comrades. They were brave men, determined to remain cheerful to the end. These sick men were unavoidably called upon to do hard and continuous manual labour. We dug, and dug, and dug. In the intervals of digging, we held the front line, unloaded ships, or carried water and ammunition to the trenches. The only relief from working parties was to go into the front line. Here, constant vigilance was necessary. We had virtually no artillery. Our bombs were, for the most part, made out of jam tins. It was emphatically a war between soldiers with rifles. At strategic points, we installed catapults. They were big, wooden, Y-shaped affairs, mounted on stands. You wound up the elastic as you would a tennis net, with a ratchet and pawl. You held the elastic taut by means of a swivel. Then you lit the fuse of the bomb, put it in, and released the swivel by striking it with an entrenching tool helve. Sometimes this failed to release it. I was at the southern barricade once. The Turks were only 10 or 15 yards away. They used to put a bullet through our periscope when we tried to look at them. Somebody got a face full of broken glass that morning, and a periscopic rifle brought up later was smashed. I was waiting with a blanket to smother any Turkish bombs that came over. The bombers were working their infernal machine behind me. It blew up. Nobody was hurt. The bombers, without a word of warning to me, had taken refuge behind a traverse. There was a crash, a blinding flash, dust, smoke, and a smell of burnt explosive. I do not often swear in those days, but I was very offensive to those bombers. It was often difficult to find shade of any sort in the trenches, and one grilled all day in the hot sun. We were allowed to remove our equipment in the daytime and wear instead a bandolier and our ridiculous little respirator, which fortunately there was no need, a handful of chemically treated cotton waste wrapped in a muslin. It was impossible to get any real rest in the daytime. The scorching sun, and above all the clouds of obscene, buzzing flies, saw to that. At night we did sentry duty, an hour on and an hour off. You would keep yourself awake by firing at the Turk's parapet. The report of your rifle and the kick of the butt into your shoulder would jerk you back out of the semi-consciousness of approaching sleep. As soon as you had fired, you would duck. Some Turks would fire back at the flash. You would jerk back the bolt of your rifle. There would be a whiff of burnt cordite and the tinkle of the brass cartridge case falling on the hard earth. When your hour was finished, you would shake your opposite number violently, and he would stumble up, swaying drunkenly, to take your place on the fire step. I have known men get up in their sleep halfway through their rest period and claw their way up onto the fire step. Unloading ships was a change from digging. I remember one such expedition very well. We fell in at dusk with rifle, bandolier, and respirator. We took them everywhere with us. If the Turks attacked seriously, these things might be needed, even on the beach. We journeyed across the sandy waste that separated us from W Beach. They told us it had been in April, green grass, starred with millions of beautiful flowers, but it seemed incredible. We went down the slope leading to W Beach between the cliffs to what had once been the scene of the terrible Lancashire landing. The Lancashires had landed from open boats and won this beach and hinterland in their April landing, in the face of appalling fire and terrible barbed wire entanglements. The Turkish barbed wire was dreadful stuff. It was all very peaceful now under the stars, the strange quiet waterfront blanketed with sand and dust. No arc lamps, no friendly ship's lights, no noise, no shouting. Instinctively, everyone spoke quietly, though there was no real need for quietness. The Turks were 5 miles away, and the Scotsmen of the 52nd Division used to play the bagpipes in the evenings in the rest camp next to ours. I associate the peninsula in those later days with quietness. People seldom shouted and sang. Quietness, the crackle of machine gun and rifle, the very occasional drone of a shell, the chirping of countless grasshoppers during the day, the unending singing of cicalas at night, the occasional raucous scream of a mule in some unit's transport lines. Up in the front line, you would probably hear a dog baying in the Turkish trenches, occasionally the chanting of a muezzin, and at dawn, the homely sound of the crowing of cocks in the rest camp, where the officers' messes nearly all kept a few poultry, bought from Greek boats on the beach. Down on the beach, the thick dust silenced the footsteps of men and animals. The water lapped quietly against the sides of lighters, the piles of the homemade pier and the sunken craft that had gone to its making. We boarded a tow of lighters, going out to a ship lying somewhere in the darkness. We heard the hiss of steam from a tug, the scrape of the fireman's shovel, the tinkle of a bell, the tightening of hawsers. Our tow was underway. A chill wind was blowing, and there was a lumpy sea. The lighters constantly jerked at their tow ropes, zigzagging this way and that. The tug slowed down, and we glided alongside a steamer. Her steel sides towered above us. Accommodation ladders were let down. The lighters were made fast. Half of us stayed aboard the lighters. The other half swarmed up the rope ladders onto the steamer's deck. It was not easy on account of the sea that was running. You had to wait your turn, and when the lighter was on the crest of a wave, seize the ladder waving above you in the darkness. The ship was loaded with pit props for the dugouts of the beach dwellers. At first I had the pleasant job of standing at the open hatch and shouting to the donkey men when the sling was full. There would be a creak as the derrick chain tightened, a rattle from the donkey engine, and up would come the load, swaying wildly from side to side of the hold. I had then to guide it across the deck and see it lowered safely into the waiting lighter. This was a far more ticklish matter at the send of the sea whilst making the ship and the lighters roll drunkenly. It must have been far from pleasant for those left in the lighters, wallowing against the ship's side with a heavy slingful of pit props descending upon their heads out of the darkness. I then had to let the donkey man know when they had unhooked the chain, and it could be rewound and the derrick swung inboard again. That night, in the Aegean, I was realizing one of my boyhood ambitions. I had watched ships being unloaded many times and always longed to stand on the deck directing operations. Now I was actually doing it in circumstances I had never dreamed of. Even with dysentery, lice, dirt, and flies, life held its compensations. Later, another man took my place as the rest from the heavy work in the hold, and I descended to take his place. I can see now the dimly lit interior of the hold, the swaying hurricane lamps making huge uncouth shadows on the white timber and beyond the ring of outer darkness. The light shone on uncouth men in faded puggarees and cap comforters, bronzed flesh and dust-coloured clothing, staggered about with pit props, lurching and falling as the ship rolled. The light from the swinging lamps shone first on one and then on another, and the great black shadows were like writhing giants. From above came the hiss of steam and the rattle of winches, and in the hold the smell of bilge wrestled with the sweet smell of sawn timber. Work must go on quickly, as the steamer must be emptied before dawn showed her to the Turkish batteries at Achi Baba. As far as I know, I shot nothing on the peninsula. Turks were very abundant, but their burrowing proclivities made them difficult to kill. One fired continually at the flashes of their rifles at night. I was never a bloodthirsty person. I have done a very little shooting. I do not like killing animals or men. The first time we were in the trenches, I saw, as I watched through the periscope, the head and shoulders of a Turk rise above the sandbags. He was a young man in dust-coloured beehive hat. He had no beard, but long, hanging moustaches, like those of a stage brigand. I watched him fascinated as he looked coolly around him. He looked rather an heroic figure. I felt no desire to send a bullet crashing through his brain and convert him to one of those horrid, unnatural scarecrows I could see lying in no man's land, covered with heaps of rotting equipment like horses fallen in harness and left. On the other hand, we were fighting a war, and I was being paid, if I remember rightly, 1 and 10 pence a day, and all found to kill Turks. For this purpose, I had been transported, at great cost to the government, to the eastern Mediterranean. The Turks were killing our fellows in great numbers. This Turk must die by my hand. "There's a Turk here," I said, "pushing his snout over the parapet. Shoot him, you fool!" Stealthily, I slid my rifle along the groove in the sandbags. I got the Turk's head balanced on the tip of the foresight correctly aligned in the center of the U of the backsight. My first finger on the trigger. A voice within me seemed to be saying to the Turk, "Get down, you fool, before I shoot you." As the Turk ducked, I fired. The bullet whistled harmlessly into space behind the Turkish lines. "Got him?" said Barr at my elbow. "Afraid not," I said. "This blighter ducked just in time." "You should have been a sight quicker," said Burr. "You can't expect Johnny Turk to wait there all day to be shot." There were small lizards running about everywhere in the scrub, the common viviparous lizard, I think, and we occasionally found small tortoises, or they found us, tumbling into our dugouts. There were locusts and grasshoppers everywhere, a great profusion of species. I remember some very beautiful ones that flew with crimson wings. Occasionally we captured a praying mantis. This creature was great fun. We would put a drop of condensed milk on the ground and seat the mantis near it, his great forelegs raised in an attitude of devotion. The condensed milk would attract the inevitable flies, and the mantis would seize them and devour them with comic relish, turning his head this way and that, even to the extent of pointing his chin skyward. We applauded the performance and enjoyed it thoroughly, our pleasure unalloyed by compunction for the fly. My heart is full of affection and pity for nearly all living things, but for flies I have neither pity nor mercy. Rightly was the evil one called by the ancient Hebrews Beelzebub, the lord of flies. Flies are his servants, doing his bidding and doing it well, torturing the living, rending intolerable the last hours of the dying, defiling the bodies of the dead, enemies of man and woman and child and beast, utterly evil. I remember well the first wounded man I saw brought in. One of the first mornings I was in the front line, the word was passed along for stretcher bearers. They hurried by. By and by, they came back. We crouched on the fire step to allow the stretcher to get past. Sweat was pouring off our D Company stretcher bearers as they pushed and heaved the heavy stretcher round the traverse. On the stretcher lay a man in a semi-comatose condition, rolling slightly from side to side with the movements of the bearers. His cap had been put over his face to protect him from the sun. His tunic and trousers were undone, and his shirt pushed up around his chest. He had been shot in the abdomen or the groin. The stretcher bearers had done their best for him. On the glistening flesh and soiled dressings were what appeared to be great bunches of black grapes. An angry buzz rose from the black mass when the stretcher was jolted against a traverse. There were scorpions. Their sting was extremely painful, though seldom fatal. People were always being bitten or stung by something. There were large brown centipedes about 4 inches long. They crawled over you in the trenches or in your dugout. There was a technique in dealing with them. Their sharp, hook-like feet were raked backwards. It was well to remember this. A smart flip on the backside was the way to deal with Mr. Centipede. If you forgot your natural history and tried to brush him off backwards, you suffered for a long time afterwards from an almost intolerably painful wheal, as though the flesh had been seared with a hot iron. Gallipoli was not a pleasant place in 1915. We made the best of it. Certain war books which I have read rightly stress the horror and suffering and squalor of active service, but they tend, I think, to leave an impression which is unjust to the memory of brave men.